We now proceed to the presentation of Ms. Shirley Bolaños and Professor Bercilia on gender and resilience in coastal communities.
Okay. Shirley, would you want to begin while I set up the presentation?
Okay. Okay, so am I clear? My audio?
Yes. Yes, you can.
Yeah.
Very clear. Thank you.
Yeah.
Can you now see the slides, huh? Yes, sure.
Yes.
Okay. So good afternoon to everyone, and also thank you to the APSA 2021 organizers for this opportunity also to share our work in coastal communities in the eastern seaboard of the Philippines, along the Pacific coast of in Sorsogon and Albay. So just like the sharing a while ago by some of the resource personnel as well, that Coastal Corps started working with coastal communities by way of organizing and training them as towards the building of community-based coastal resource management movements, especially in these areas along the Pacific coast. So the original and the goal really is to establish the CBCRM movement. And so we've been working on that aspect for more than a little over a decade. And there were various success stories and policy transformations that happened in these areas where we work, pertaining to resource management and fisher folk participation, voices, and empowerment along those decade of work. So at the end of the decade, we've conducted, we call it actually a sort of people's evaluation or fisher folk evaluation of our program on CBCRM, and as the fisher folks and the fisher folk leaders and local officials acknowledge the contribution of the programs into coming out with fisheries policies, transform policies. But in terms of livelihoods and income improvement among fisher folks, it was negligible, or there's a very low impact on the economic and livelihood opportunities for the fishing families. And so with the strong recommendation from the fisher folks and the fisher folks is really to focus on for the next decade of our work, to focus on developing the livelihoods and improving their income. As we know that in the Philippines, especially in the Philippines, the fisher folk households are among the poorest households according to the Philippine Statistics Authority. So we sit on that context that indeed there are, like farmers, they have very limited access to enterprises or facilities to improve their income and other livelihood sources. So, but before we did it, it was clear, the mandate was very clear for us to really strengthen the livelihoods and develop it into more resilient livelihoods, as we are sitting also in the context of multiple hazards that occurs year in and year out in these areas along the Pacific. So, and we are also conscious that the impacts of climate change are already being felt along these coastal communities. And so we first we attempted and we developed with the coastal communities, with the partner communities, to first conduct the risk assessments before actually proceeding into developing or enhancing the livelihoods that they have now. And so we unpacked it first by way of examining the different hazards that these communities faces almost how many times in a year, and what are those exposed elements or assets uh, among these coastal communities. So those are listed in this slide, no, on the upper left and right boxes. So we know these are the assets and exposed elements in the fishing and household coastal communities. And then we also investigated or further examined the various risks that this hazards and exposure brought to these families and coastal communities. So it definitely, every after big disasters, big disasters or catastrophic disasters, more intense poverty among these households or fishing families, food insecurity, damage and loss of dwellings and other assets or properties, intense burden and stress on women. Prolonged and intense rainfall also means no fishing, no catch, no income, and decreased fisher production. It was also observed by the fisher folks that the seasonality of fishing has already changed, and they've called it it's already disturbed. The outbreak of diseases to children and elderly every after a disaster is always a scenario, and the sea level rise impact to the communities are also very evident as well, and the displacement of family and its members, resettlement issues, and we call it also temporary out migration or seeking temporary work outside the community in order to bridge the family from intense poverty every after disaster. More community disruptions and tensions among families and community. So also we look into the various vulnerabilities of this coastal and household in coastal communities. So there are various multidimensional inequities and inequalities among these fishing and coastal communities. Small boats that cannot withstand the powerful Pacific waves, the given poor living conditions, from physical living conditions to psychological living conditions, and other weaknesses and vulnerabilities of these housing families. And so Coastal Core was also from this realities of hazards, exposure, and risk and vulnerabilities of fishing households and fishing communities. Coastal Core's goal also is really to first interrogate, as Ma'am Emma's word, to use Ma'am Emma's words, is to interrogate the various underlying causes of poverty. That includes also the gender issues among communities and families. So the main strategy that we've employed into developing livelihood resilience under this context of and challenges is household organizing and self-help organizing towards sustainable livelihoods development. So we adopted Christian Aid's then goal to for individuals and communities to gain the power to live with dignity, responding effectively to disasters and risks and the opportunities they face. So next slide, please. So we employed and please just yeah. So the household organizing process is shown in this slide, and the most what do you call this, challenging step or stage is actually on the first stage, no, and on the, I think, third stage. The first stage is the household orientation, the families that will be involved, that are willing to participate in the process before developing eventually their livelihood. So household orientations, asset profiling, family visioning and planning, and synergy enhancement exercises among households and family members. So usually we used 5 modules in running this household orientations and synergy enhancement among families, among fishing families. It is also a fact in the Philippines that a lot of fishing households or coastal communities, there's also a high incidence of domestic violence among fishing families, and we've documented and also investigated the reasons, the causes why there's a high incidence of violence or domestic violence in coastal communities or fishing families. So sitting on that data or information that mostly we know that most of these fishing families are elementary or basic education graduate or not, or didn't even graduated in the elementary or basic education. So the challenge is really for us to capacitate and orient them in the manner that they can really understand well. And so that 5 modules are actually the start. It starts with self-awareness by way of using the my body, myself, my personhood module that are given to women, and then to husbands, and then to children. So there's a manner also of conducting it. We've developed it together with other experts in order to do it professionally and morally or socially grounded. And so from that first level, we proceed in the continuation of capacity building for families for values enhancement, practical life skills development. Practical life skills includes how to arrive or how to do decisions or decision making skills, family communications, and then responsible parenting and shared home management, and then proceed with financial and capacity development for home-based livelihoods that the families identified based on their capacities, based on their on the very low cost to very minimal assets or capital that's needed, whether it's financial or labor capital. So that's the third stage, and then we that is in that stage that we also entered into agreements with different agencies of the government that serves or that has services for livelihoods development. So with Department of Trade and Industry, with some academe also in our areas, in order to develop these capacities towards the development of livelihoods, and then packaging and marketing and networking, down to the monitoring also of this family. So there are family agreements that has to be monitored. The children are involved as well in this monitoring and documentation of income increases, of production, and their agreements. So in the families. Next slide, please. Hi, this is Jack.
Yeah, can you see the slide, Shirley?
Yes.
Yeah.
So yeah. So
we have 2 minutes more, Shirley. We have 2 minutes to go. Okay.
On the recorded or documented outcomes out of these processes, where there's an improved participatory decision making, responsibility sharing in the households and in their livelihoods that they've agreed to do and to develop, and then transform power relations among these households, and recognition of women's contribution to productive and community work, and then the evident diversification of income sources, given that fishing households really has to develop diversified sources since the climate challenges are increasing, and then improve income and reduce gender-based violence according to the narratives and documents by the village or barangay officials, the reduced occurrences or cases of gender violence, the improved community cohesion and collaborative work with LGUs and other stakeholders, especially on environmental management and resilience building among villages or communities where we work with. And then next, I think, yeah, next slide, Ms. Jack.
Okay, this will be already on the.
Okay, so that was my yeah.
Okay, so this will now be
the
the final slide.
Also,
yes, continue, Shirley.
Yes, Ms. Jack. So I'm giving this to Ms. Jessica because I'm not academician as well, so I am a practitioner, and I did seek the help of Professor Jessica to help me in this presentation. So I'll give you also, Ms. Jessica, in this last slide on academic policy and practice implications.
I'll stop share a bit, no, and we'll, because we're having trouble with the final slide.
Internet.
But yeah, I think it's in the internet. But just to say, I hope that you are able to see this, no. So on a couple of things around this, around the policy implications, you know, and academic implications. So number one, just to say that we've worked with Shirley for quite some time now, for over a decade, and part of the strategy that was developed was actually also a product of a study, you know, of some Asian approaches, particularly in Japan, which informed the household-based organizing approach. No? But in terms of the future prospects, number one, that the analysis of power dynamics in households and transformational potential of gender approaches to livelihoods and well-being is very, very possible. So it's moving theory to practice. No? The second lesson in this initiative is that, as Shirley mentioned before, organizing was very much focused on cooperatives, you know, and organizations, fisheries organizations. But at this point in time, it's household, family as the central point of resilience and sustainable development. And there's a distinction between, across the years now of working with Coastal Corps and their work with fishing communities, there has been a distinction between the alternative and supplemental livelihoods for livelihood diversification as a process. So we need to be able to distinguish what are the alternative versus supplemental livelihoods that can be developed in the community. Fourthly, there's value in developing home-based approaches and family synergy approaches for development. And that evidence-based approaches and proof of concept for resilience can draw in resilience investments. What Shirley did not say is that the initial piloting activities that they had in small communities generated more investments into the home-based approaches, household-based approaches from DSWD, from donor agencies, and that approach has been used now for over a decade in the region. Finally, this approach needs to be institutionalized. You know, if there is to be sustainability, and it needs to be mainstream in the planning and development processes. And so Shirley and her team and the community women have now started engaging with local government units and the regional development councils to ensure that this approach gets supported by the government. So we end the presentation there. So thank you very much. I now turn you over to Ma'am Tess. Ma'am Tess, perhaps we can have the Q&A right after the presentations of our reactors in the interest of time. Thank you.